Good day, everyone. For today's discussion, I'm going to share you about the educational system. But first, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Adrian P. Baldonado, the fifth reporter of the group. But let's continue. So, what is educational system? During those times, the Philippines educational system was pitiful and limited to the wealthy few. Intellectual development can be seen in the middle class, but it was always censored by the friars for fear of exposing the country's injustice. Because there is no government intervention in schools, are free to add or remove topic from their curricula, knowledge was measured in terms of students' ability to memorize, severely impeding intellectual progress. At during the time Rizal or during late 18th century to 19th century, the friars occupied the Philippines. This prior controlled the educational system in the Philippines, and they were able to own different schools comprising from the primary level to the tertiary levels of education. The people who took charge in teaching, implementation of the rules and regulation, and of the monitoring of students were assigned to missionaries during that time. The teachings of the Catholic religion were emphasized to the levels of education in the schools owned by the friars. In the primary level, they were taught of the Christian doctrines, how to read Spanish book, and a little of the native language. In the universities, science and mathematics were not very much introduced to the students. Instead of Spanish, students were taught how to speak and understand Latin. And also, education was characterized by the 4Rs. Rizal had his early education in Calamba and Binyan. It was a typical schooling that son of an ilustrado family received during his time, characterized by the 4Rs: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. Instruction was rigid and strict. Knowledge was forced into the minds of the pupils by means of the tedious memory method aided by the teacher's whip. Despite the defect of the Spanish system of elementary education, Rizal was able to acquire the necessary instruction preparatory for college work in Manila. It may be said that Rizal, who was born a physical weakling, rose to become an intellectual giant not because of, but rather in spite of, the outmoded and backward system of the instruction obtaining in the Philippines during the last decades of Spanish regime. And also, Rizal always considered education as a medicine or something that could cure the problems of colonial Philippines. He believed in education that is free from political and religious control. He asserted that reform cannot be achieved if there is no sustainable education, a liberal one available of Filipinos. On Rizal's concept of education as the topic, I would like to think that the things I will discuss are merely historical data, gathered to guide us the interpretation of the subject. Each one, to my mind, should interpret the subject based on his orientation, experience, and knowledge of Rizal. Rizal always considered education as a medicine or something that could cure the problems of colonial Philippines. He believed in education that is free from political and religious. He, has, he asserted that reform cannot be achieved if there is no suitable education, a liberal one of the available to Filipinos. Rizal is not happy at the University of Santo Tomas compared with his students' days at the Ateneo Municipal. At least he enjoyed the little freedom students were given in the expressing themselves. This could not find at the Dominican documentation. In one of the chapters, his Elfili Rizal talk about Placindo Penente and how he disliked education In spite of the fact that people recognize his exceptional capability to learn and his town folks believe him to be the brightest students Tanuan, Batangas. A proof is that the town curate even consider him already a filibustero, an accolade given only to people who are known to their revolutionary ideas like Filipo Sopong Tansyo. It was a similar situation that Rizal was in when he left the UST without completing his studies. Rizal was looking for other things of greater usefulness and this could only find true. In spite of the schools, college and university established in the Philippines, he admit that the effect of education to the population was useless. Rizal added that for 5 or 10 years, the youth comes on contact with his books, chosen by the very same priest who boldly declared that is an evil for the Filipinos to know Spanish, that the Filipinos should not be separated from his Scarborough, that he should not have any further ambition. During the same period, majority of the students have grasped nothing more than what we book says, not even what their professor understand of it. In the other words, Filipinos were not allowed to think. Students were subject to the daily preaching that lowers human dignity, gradually or brutally killing their self-respect, that internal tenacious, persist effort to humble the native, to make him accept the yoke, to reduce him the level. During the time of Rizal, first, discrimination during the early times was very much utilized. This is because the school before were exclusive only for the Spaniards. Filipinos were only able to attend school in the late 19th century. Some schools are also limited their lodging to the sons of wealth, Filipino families. Friars hardly discriminated Filipinos because even if they were able to enter school and study, the friar believed that Filipinos would not still be able to match their skill, and they will only learn fast if they would strictly implement disciplinary action or the means applying corporal punishment. Also, during their time, the schools for boys and girls were separated. Schools for the boys were the first one that were established in 1565. Augustinians built the first school in the Philippines that was situated in Cebu. And second, during the Spanish regime, college was already equal to a university. Most common course was Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor in Arts because the Jesus established the first college for boys in Manila and name was Colegio de San Ignacio. They also established other schools like Colegio de San Ildefonso in Cebu in 1595 and Colegio de San Jose in 1601. For the meantime, the school Escuela Pia was entrusted by the government for the Jesuits. Later, this was called Ateneo de Municipal, which is now the famous Ateneo de Manila University, while the Dominicians also made a name as they established one of the popular university in the Philippines, the University of Santo Tomas, that was opened in 1611. Dominicans also built the San Juan de Letran, but only for the orphan boys. And also the third is that the first college school for girls was opened in 1589, and this was Colegio de San Potenciana. Colegio de Santa Isabel opened in 1632 because the religious congregation also established schools for the girls, and it was eventually called Beaterio. It was meant for orphan girls who could not afford to attend school and educate themselves. The subject in the Beaterio taught housekeeping, cooking, sewing, and embroidery making. Even if discrimination was utilized by the friars, they also brought a good impact to us, Filipinos. The friars were effective in evangelizing the Catholic religion to the Filipinos. There is one major failure in the educational system of the religious parishioners, and it was the preventing the Filipinos to learn the other bodies of knowledge. They limit education to the teaching of Spanish, Latin, and Filipino language. The teaching of religion was also emphasized. Mathematics and science was absolutely neglected. And the fourth is education under the Spanish administration was privileged only to Spanish students because Philippine education was only means to remain in the Philippines as colonizer. Filipinos become followers to the Spaniards even if these things happen here in the Philippines. Filipinos were greatly influenced by the Spaniards to the extent that even their lifestyle were already influenced by the Spaniards. The education Filipinos were called as Ilustrados, and they began movements directed towards change in the government in the Philippines. They wanted to be the same level in the proud Spaniards. The growing numbers of Ilustrados in the Philippines is considered as one of the major effects of education by the Spaniards in the Philippines. And last, how would you compare the educational system of the Philippines during Jose Rizal times with the educational system of today? The first Philippines public education system that was instituted in 1863 was definitely more inclusive to Filipinos regardless of the racial backgrounds, although it was not socio-economically inclusive by present-day standards. Nevertheless, it paved way for the emerge of native Filipinos intelligentsia class called Ilustrados, who eventually resisted the excess of Spanish colonial regime in the country, dominated by the Catholic friars through the usage of the Spanish language as a medium to the communicate of the Spanish government in Madrid and to the Filipino people who didn't speak a common native based on lingua franca that time. And the present day Philippine public education system is based on the American system which was instituted after the United States took over the country from Spain through the Treaty of the Paris. The most salient feature of the American education system implanted in the Philippines in 1901 is the usage of the English language as a medium of instruction instead of the pre-existing Spanish language. Hence, Filipinos today speaks English instead of Spanish thanks to the American occupation of the country. And that's all. Thank you for listening. God bless us all.